What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of, that's right, Master the NEC, where we talk about the National Electrical Code and just about anything electrically related. I hope everybody's having a wonderful holiday season and getting ready to get rid of this 2020, because I'm telling you what, I am ready to get rid of it. I'm ready for it to go. It's been a lot of business-wise pretty decent year, but personal-wise, with my loss of my mom and all this other garbage, I'm just ready for it to go. This COVID-19 crap, just ready for it to go. So hopefully you are all gearing up for 2021, put all this in the past, even though the COVID thing will linger. Let's put it all in the past and kind of move forward and see whether or not 2021 will be a better year for everybody. So today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit about a topic that, again, I can tell you that it probably doesn't get talked about. And if you go searching for it, you're not going to find a lot of people that can explain it or be able to make it clear for you. And to be honest with you, unless you're living in a certain part of the country that's rural, whereas you have a lot of farms, then you might not need to know how to do this unless, of course, you're taking an exam, and you might get some low-hanging fruit questions that would think, hey, I'll test your knowledge because you probably don't know a thing about farm load calculation. So, as you guessed it, that's what today's show's about. Absolutely. All right, enough of that. About farm loads. And so we're going to be looking at Article 220, and we're going to be focusing on Part 5. Now, we're going to do it at a very high level, 30,000-foot view, because without having any graphics and without being able to physically show you something, which we will do in an upcoming video at some point. Again, I got so many things slated for 2021. I just don't, you have no idea. The ability to create content that I have, the graphics and the video, we can do it all here. So just trying to determine what things are more important than others is the hard part for me. It's not the content. It's I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what goes on. We'll see. But again, I am excited about the new series we've got coming up, whereas I take videos and I critique the videos, give my commentary on them, maybe even give some tips on how they could do things better and, things like that. So I'm looking forward to that. That'll be a pretty good series. So they got that we got to take care of. Many of you know that my publishing deal with King Royal, we couldn't come to an agreement for the 2020 Code Change series. So in 2021, I'm rebranding that in my own. So look forward to that. It's be a little different since I'm not under their constraints anymore. So look for that if you're into the changes or you want the changes to the 2020 NEC. Going to change it up a little bit. But we're doing most of our stuff that we're going to do, believe it or not, whether you like it or not, video-wise, is going to be over on our paid platform, over on our YouTube channel where you have a paid membership. And again, it's the pricing is so low for the value that you're going to get that we really are hoping that you're thinking about supporting us over there. Again, a small amount each month really does. And again, I have people that donate all the time to help. This is a better way. You don't have to donate. If you want to, go on and subscribe, and that way you get access to exclusive content. We're going to have some exclusive podcasts. We're going to have an exclusive podcast series and all this other stuff that's going to be available. And we're going to break it down so that you know when it's a podcast and when it's a video, and it's just a lot of good stuff going on. So hopefully you'll continue that journey with us in 2021. Free content. We still will be doing free podcasts every now and then, a couple, some free videos, but the majority of everything is obviously going to the paid platform. We got to make a living, and it's time to start, making this our future for what we want to do. Now, I've been doing this for over 30 years, so it's about time that I gear this thing right. And it was when I brought on somebody to help me who's in the background, it really, and they don't want to be known, so they are helping me with the concept of taking our academy to a different level. So that is a person to be named at some other point whenever they want to be named. And so we'll just leave it at that. So today, we're going to talk today. Oh, real quick. If you support our show and you like the logos that we create, the Code Strong, Code Warrior, Code Mafia, the Code Electrical Wizardry, all this kind of stuff, go check out our store over on that Teespring. I mean, you can get it on mugs and face masks and whatever you want. It's over there. You got to search for it because it's kind of cluttered, but there's a lot of stuff there. Inspector stuff, engineering stuff, mugs, stickers, neat stickers, big, really colorful, detailed stickers. Check those out. So I'll run that commercial real quick. That way we kind of get you thinking about helping us over there. And I will say in 2021, we're offering a feature where you can purchase certain designs on our website. And what happens is when you purchase the design, you get a unique coupon code. And then when you go to buy the shirt on our Teespring, you use the coupon code. And for that specific shirt, that we share the link for you, or mug, or whatever, and it will be personalized. It will have your name on it or your company name on it in the logo and our logo and everything like that. The Code Strong, whatever. So that's coming up in 2021. Again, our partner is really working with me to help me, get all those things straight. I'm a code guy, right? So I needed some additional help with that part of it, taking us to the next level. So anyway, let me run this commercial, and then we will get into today's hot topic. Today's show is sponsored by electricianpride.com, your one-stop shop for electrician-specific T-shirts, hoodies, phone cases, mugs, die-cut stickers, leggings, and so much more. Featuring unique designs for electricians, journeymen, and master electricians, as well as electrical engineers and electrical inspectors. For more information on all the products that are available, visit us at www.electricianpride.com today. All right. And again, we thank you to everybody out there that supports our shows. And we've got our haters out there. Every now and then you got somebody out there that just for some other reason don't like us, and we really don't care. But those that do, and we know that we help you, we again appreciate your patronage, as well as we're very thankful we have the opportunity to help you. All right, so today's topic, okay, enough of that. Today's topic is we're going to talk a little bit about Part 5 of Article 220, which is farm loads. Now, farm load calculations, you might never encounter a farm load calculation. And if you're like me, you go your whole career and you really don't deal with a farm, yet what you're doing when you're doing a service or feeder calculation, you probably do it all the time for branch circuits, but you don't really think about it. Now, on a farm, you probably have a dwelling unit, and then, of course, you have a barn or other outbuildings that might have power and those things like that. So you kind of got to think that at least the dwelling unit, I treat it just like a dwelling unit. Well, you do, but there's some things you have to be aware of when you're doing a load calculation or the portion that would be for the dwelling unit. Then you would do it if it was just like any other dwelling. You would use the standard or optional method, your choice. But there's some caveats to that, and it has to do with the other areas of the farm, right? If you have other loads and things like that. So that's kind of what we're gonna kind of dabble in today and kind of talk about it a little bit. So we are working out of the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code. So if you've got your 2020 edition, if not, pause the podcast and go get your 2020 edition, crack that sucker open to Article 220, jump on down to Part 5, and you'll notice it's entitled Farm Load Calculations. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So as you can see, it's not a very big part, and it's just got, Part 5, and it's got a Section 100, 102, and 103. That's it. It's got some tables that are associated with it. You have to learn how to use the tables. We'll talk about it a little bit today. Again, this is being this being audible rather than visual. It's going to be tough for some people, so I get it. Now, I will tell you, this is a cheap plug. Over on our paid subscription that we have over on our YouTube channel, where you actually pay a monthly subscription, a small amount, to have access to specific content, which I will remind you in 2021, we have some specific live streams that are going to be weekly that only can be accessed by members. So that's something to look forward to. We're no longer going to be doing our Wednesday night exam prep. We'll be doing an exam prep, but it'll only be for students that are in the Fast Tracks program or that are in the paid subscription. And so, again, the subscription for that, I believe, is $11.99 a month. Dude, if you add that up over the year, that is a massive value, okay? Because you're going to get access to those streams every Wednesday night. They typically last about 2 hours. Bring your questions. We're going to talk about things that are in the Fast Tracks program, which are germane to not just the Fast Track students, but also people who are just trying to learn the NEC. So that's going to be great. And it's kind of going to be like our previous live streams, but it's going to be closed door now. So it won't be open to the public. And I know some people hate that because they say everything's going monetized now. But it is a business, and I love helping people, but we have to take it to the next level. So I'm sorry for those that don't understand. It is what it is. There's plenty of other free resources out there. I encourage you. There's great educators all over. Seek them out. They're really good. Everybody's trying to do the same thing, right? Teach you the code. All right. So part 5, farm load calculations. So the first thing we want to do is we want to read the general. So this general meaning that it says farm load shall be calculated in accordance with part 5. Okay, we know that. So we're going to use part 5 to calculate out farm load calculations. Now, 220.102 is broken into an A and a B. A is dealing with how you calculate the load for the dwelling unit, if there's a dwelling unit on the farm. And of course, B deals with everything other than the dwelling unit. Okay. Another thing to remember that you would use 220.102A versus A and B is if you have a dwelling unit on the premise and you're going to calculate that dwelling unit out just like you would a normal dwelling unit. If it had its separate service, of course, you're going to have to do something if it has what's called a common service, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to keep it simple. If I have a dwelling on the premise, on the farm, then I'm going to calculate that dwelling out just like I normally would using a standard or optional method. If I have a barn with a separate service or some other type of panel supplying other pieces of equipment that supplies at least 2 branch circuits from that equipment, like maybe another, like a service panel, and then it kind of drops out and hits different pieces of equipment, then I'm going to use 220.102B for those loads calculations for those feeder or service calcs. So it's this or that, for dwellings, it's going to tell me what to do in A. And for other than dwellings, it's going to tell me what to do in B. So let's kind of look at it first from a dwelling unit perspective. Here's what 220.102A says, dwelling unit. It says the feeder or service load of a farm dwelling unit shall be calculated in accordance with the provisions for dwellings in Part 3 or 4 of this article. Of course, this article being Article 220, Part 3 being standard method, and Part 4 being optional method. Now, one of the important key factors here is it says feeder or service. So a good example of that would be if the service panel is right on the side of the dwelling or in the dwelling. I mean, that's obviously going to be service, but you could have a panel service disconnect remote and then a feeder is actually feeding the dwelling. So that's why it says feeder and service. So in case anybody gets confused with that. So that's what you do. You use Part 3 or Part 4. Now that is if you have the service coming to the dwelling unit, just like you would a standard dwelling, 1 and 2 family dwelling. Now, here's where it gets a little bit trickier, but I don't think so when you see the context behind it. It says, where the dwelling has electric heat and the farm, and that's anywhere on the farm, has electric grain drying systems, then Part 4 of this article shall not be used for calculating the dwelling load, where the dwelling and farm loads are supplied by a common service. So if I have farm loads and I have a dwelling, and those farm loads are also supplied by the same common service that's supplying the dwelling, okay, then at that point, if the dwelling has electric heat and somewhere on the farm we have electric grain drying systems, then I cannot use the optional method to calculate the dwelling. Now, remember, that has nothing to do with the calculation we haven't done yet for the other than dwelling. We're just talking about the dwelling, and it's giving us direction. It's saying, okay, so if you have electric heat in the dwelling and you have electric grain dried system somewhere on the farm, because that's what you do, then you cannot use the optional method. You can only use the standard method to calculate the load for the dwelling. That's why I tell people all the time, it's still important for you to understand how to do a standard calculation in Part 3. Many people will say you never have to use it. You always can use part 4, but this is a classic example where you would not be able to use the optional method. And you need to know how to use the standard method. And hopefully you do know how to use the standard method, because if you don't, you need to go to our Fast Tracks program, get hooked up with it. You're going to learn so many calculations. It'll make your head spin. It's the greatest program out there for learning the NEC. So check it out, our Fast Tracks program. It's available on our website, masterthenec.com, if you want to get a detailed, in-depth knowledge of the National Electrical Code. That's the only way to do it, really. I mean, you could do it by flipping, but again, you just won't absorb it the same way than if we test you, and test your knowledge, and you will get it. It's a method to the madness, trust me. All right, so in that scenario right there, this has to do with a common service. So a service that would be, let's say, going from a transformer, let's say it's a service drop coming down. That's a common service, and that's going to be supplying both the dwelling and the other than dwelling loads. That's a common service. And if that's the case, and I have, again, electric heat in the dwelling and electric grain drying system somewhere on the property, on the farm, and it all being supplied by that common service, then just remember that when I'm doing that dwelling calc, that I cannot use an optional method. It has to be the standard. Now, again, if it's a separate service to the dwelling and a separate service to the other loads, they're both separate, then obviously for that dwelling, I can use standard or optional method perfectly fine. And again, hoping you know how to do the standard and the optional method. All right, so let's move on. So that's pretty cut and dry. Now, one thing I will remind you is remember that thing about common service, because if that's the case, then we're going to have to do what's called a total calculation as well, okay? Where we're going to add that service, we're going to add that load for the dwelling in with the calculation that we're going to need to do for those other than dwelling loads that are on the farm, okay? Okay, so again, the first thing we're just trying to do here is qualify what method we can use for the dwelling unit, okay? And there we go. All right, so the next thing we're going to move to is other than dwelling unit. So this is 220.102b. It says other than dwelling unit. Now this is all of those loads that have nothing to do with the dwelling unit, okay? It says where the feeder or service supplies a farm building or other loads having 2 or more separate branch circuits. So, I mean, again, I could feed a panel, and out of that has 2 separate branch circuits feeding 2 or more different loads. And it would be, you would use this method to do that. It says the load for feeders, service conductors, and service equipment shall be calculated in accordance with the demand factors not less than indicated in table 220.102. So this brings us to the table. So and if you're looking for that table on this page, you're not going to see it in the softbound edition. So you got to flip the page. And then it starts to get a little bit mixed up here with Article 225. And then all of a sudden you have table 220.88 popping out at you. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. It's the small little tables on the right side of the page that say table 220.102 method for calculating farm loads for other than dwelling units. And you'll look at this table. And when you look at it, you'll think this is pretty simple. But then after you start studying it or trying to do an example, you'll say, okay, maybe, just maybe, this isn't as simple as I thought it would be. So what I'm going to do is going to run you through some scenarios, and I'll just give you some values, and you just listen, and I'm hoping that you'll absorb this information because, again, it is not the easiest thing to be able to put in your mind because you got 2 things going on here. You have a reduction of connected loads on one side that you're working with, but if you follow those rules, it'll give you demand factor values in amps that you're going to use for your load calculation on the other side over here, on the right side of your little chart here. So I'm going to try to work you through this and try to make it as painless as possible. And again, at any time you get confused, I'll just remind you that the subscribers over on our YouTube channel have an exclusive video where I actually break all this down in video format. And you're thinking, well, you suck, Paul, because you're not giving it to us for free. That's why they get the paid content, and you're getting the podcast. Okay? Again, don't like it? I can always say, create your own content. Okay? Can't please everybody, right? All right, so if you look in the National Electrical Code under table 220.102, you're going to see that it says under the table. And, of course, I'll remind you a couple things. We're dealing with a farm. This farm is a 122 40-volt single-phase load to this farm. Okay. And we got to do some things here. So let's kind of, first, I'll also throw out there that we're going to say that we have a total ampere rating. We added all our load calculations. We added everything up using part 2. We got all of our values together. And so we know that there's 385 amps of total ampere rated load that is on this farm. Okay, and other than dwellings, just the farm loads, we'll say it's 385 amps. Okay, just throwing a number out there. So when you're doing the demand factors, you know that you're not going to be working with the 385, right? The whole notion of a demand factor means that you're going to have some value less than 385, right? So if you think of it this way, and here's what I like to tell people to do. If you look at that table, you see where it says about halfway down, it says first 60 amperes of the load, and then underneath it, it has next 60 amperes of all other loads. What you want to do is kind of draw a little line there. Or you can highlight the top part and just leave the next 60 amperes of all the other load and remaining of the loads, kind of leave that unhighlighted. However you want to do it. We're trying to show that there's steps that you have to follow. Okay? And so let's kind of work through this. So we said that our load was 385 amps. It says right here in the table, it says the greater of the following. It says all loads that are expected to operate simultaneously or 125% of the full load current of the largest motor or the first 60 amperes of the load. Okay, so I have to take the larger of whichever one of those will apply here. So let's say of that 385 amps, we looked at it and we determined that at any given time, the loads that are expected to operate simultaneously add up to, say, 65 amps. So I might have a conveyor running and a blower running, or I might something running, and I've looked at the way these things work. I mean, you're the farm guy, or you're doing a calculation, right? You have to ask questions. And you're like, okay, of these loads, you need to tell me which loads are going to operate simultaneously. And then you add those loads up. And in our case, we say it was 65 amps. That's our simultaneous load. Okay, so we still have to compare that, right? Well, we already know that it's more than the third one, which says first 60 amperes of the load, because the first 60 amperes of the 385 is 60 amperes. And we already know that if we said the simultaneous load was 65 amps based on our, looking at the different loads, then we already know that's larger than the first 60 of the load, which is just 60. So we can get rid of that option. So 65 for the simultaneous loads is still, so far, the greater of the loads. The next one that we would have to look at would be the largest motor. So let's say in this case, we have a 10 horsepower, 240 volt single phase motor. Now, if you were to take that and understand that the 240 volt, we're going to use 230 when we go back to the tables in 430, because that's just how motors work, is you'll notice that 430.248 for a 10 horsepower motor that is single phase will be 50 amperes. Okay, and if you didn't do that, pause the podcast and go to your code book and go into 430.248 and look at the table. Find the 230, which is, again, 230 is what you're going to get with the 240 volt nominal. And you go down and you'll notice that a 10 horsepower is 50 amperes. Now, of course, in all things that we deal with, we know that we have to treat that motor as a continuous duty unless states otherwise, so we're going to take that at 125%. So, again, that's our normal rules that we follow in 430. And so that would be 50 times 125%, which is 62.5 amps. Okay. Now, 62.5 amps is not more than the 65 amps that we first calculated out or we selected out as our loads that would be running simultaneously, right? So that tells us that the motor load, it's not going to be greater, so we get rid of that. So the largest load that we have right now is that 65 amps of simultaneous load that we determined by looking at all the equipment and how they're going to operate. So now, once I got that 65, if you look at the right side of the table, that's the very first demand factor of value that you can utilize, because you take that at 100%, and that was 65 amps, and you take it at its full value. So write that 65 down on a little scratch piece of paper, because that is a load you have to account for. Okay, it's a demand factor that's been applied. So you write it down. So the next thing you go to is, you see where it says the next 60 amperes of the load, okay, of the loads. Okay, so what you're doing here is, remember we started at 385? Well, you have to take away the 65 from it because we still got to work with the connected load. And since we utilize 65, in order to work our way down this table, we need to slowly drop the numbers a little bit, okay? So you take the 385. Again, we're not talking about the demand. We added that 65 over here in our little list over here. That's an actual load we're going to use. We're working with connected loads now. So I take that 385, and I'm going to take away that 65 that we had, and that drops it down to 320. Now, like I said, it says the next 60 of the other load is going to take it at 50%. Now, you're not taking the 50% of the 320. You're taking 50% of the next 60 amperes. Okay? So 50% of 60 amperes is 30 amperes. So this one's pretty simple, right? You simply take that 30 amperes and add it over to that 65 amps that you did on the first step, where we chose the simultaneous load as the largest of the three options. Okay? Now, the one thing that people forget is that you still have to continually drop the connected load in order to finally get to what's called the remainder of the other load. Okay? There's a process. So we started with 385. And remember, we're trying to get a demand value, but we're still working with connected load. We take the 385, we take the 65 away, which is 320. Now, since it says the next 60, we're going to drop 60 from that 320. And that takes us down to 260. We've already got our demand value that we wanted out of it, remember? We only wanted 50% of that 60 amps, and we wrote it down. That's why we wrote 30 amps down. But we need to get to what's the remainder of the other loads, and these are the connected loads. And so that 320, you take the 60 away from it, and that drops it down. So you had 320, and that drops it down to 260. Well, a 260 is the remainder of the load, and that you take it 25%. So that would be 260 times 25%. That's 65 amps. So that third step, you take that 65 and you add it to the previous 65 and 30. So you come up with a total of 160. And 160 is the load, is the demand. That's the calculated load based on using the table. And then you have to select an overcurrent device for that. Well, quickly, you're going to go to 240.6a. You're going to notice that there is not an overcurrent device rated for 160. So this allows you to go up to a 200 amp overcurrent device. Okay. So that is actually how you use this table. And if you think about it, it's not overly complicated. It's just that many people forget that you've got one thing going on over on the left side, which is just simply reducing the connected load. And on the right side, you have the results of that effort in the demand factor. And even when I explain this, like I explained to you, there's still going to be people that just don't get it. And I don't know how to explain it any better than to explain to the left what you're doing is taking whatever the load is that you calculated, the total load at the beginning, connected load, you're subtracting whichever was the largest of your first three options. Then you're subtracting another 60, and after doing that, you'll have what's called the remaining connected load. So you started it out with 385. The largest load was 65 amps simultaneous. We subtracted that from 385 because we took that at 100%. The next 60 amperes of the load is at 50% and goes to 60. 50% of that is 30, but you still were working with 60 amperes, right? So we have to deduct that from the 320, and that's how we get down to the remaining connected load of 260, to which we apply 25% to it, okay? So what we're doing with the demand is just taking the values of our efforts, right? That's what we do with it, okay? All right. Anyway, hopefully that explains that to you. And again, it's not the easiest thing to explain, but that's how it works. Okay. All right. Let's see here. So the next thing that people let me go back here because I want to make sure I cover everything in this. So that's how you do the separate, and I got the code book with me here, so if I were kind of flipping. So that's how you do other than dwelling loads. Okay, and so this is what you would do, for example, if this was to a barn that had these loads, and there you go. That would be a 200 amp service would be what you would need to this other load, okay, other than dwelling load. So that's how you do 220.102b and using the table. Now, when we get to 220.103, this comes into play when you have that common service. So I have a common service where I have the dwelling unit and the farm loads, say farm building, and they're being supplied by one common service. If that's the case, then I have to know how to account for the different loads from the dwelling and from the other than dwellings. Now, when you get here, you're going to use the dwelling calculation that you did, whether you use part 3 or part 4, again, depending on whether you could use part 4 or not. That value is, you've got it and you want to set that aside. The only difference here is that now when you're doing the other than dwelling loads, you're not going to use 220.102b's method. You're going to use the method that's in 220.103. Okay, so I'm going to read this and then I will try to give you an example. If I can paint a picture, that'll be difficult, but I'll do my best. It says for 220.103 farm loads, it says we're supplied by a common service. That is important to note because if they had two separate services, one for the dwelling and one separate service for the farm loads, then you would treat each one of them separate and you use A or B in 220.102 and follow the instructions. Simple, right? But with a common service, it gets a little more complicated. Now, here's what it says. It says the total load of the farm, and this is the whole farm, for the service conductors and service equipment shall be calculated in accordance with the dwelling unit load. Okay, so the dwelling unit load that we should do, whether it's part 3 or part 4, optional or standard method for the dwelling unit, and the demand factors specified in table 220.103. So you would forget everything you just did in 220.102b, and you essentially, for those other than dwelling loads, you have to start over. Okay? Now, it says, it goes on to remind us, it says, where there's equipment in 2 or more farm equipment buildings, or for loads having the same function, such loads shall be calculated in accordance with table 220.102. Okay? So you'll come up with those loads, and shall be permitted to be combined into a single load in table 220.103 for calculating the total load. So if you have loads that are the same, you're able to add those loads together and bring them forward towards this calculation and be able to do it. Okay. All right. So let's kind of give an example here if I can. So if you go look at table 220.103, you'll notice there's a note at the bottom of that table. Now I always want to tell people, let's look at the note first, because that note says, to this total load, add the load of the farm dwelling unit calculation in accordance with part 3 or part 4 of this article. Again, reminding you that you cannot use option of the optional method in part 4 if you have electric heat in the dwelling and you have electric grain drying systems somewhere on the farm using under this common service. Then you can't use the optional method. Okay, you'd have to use the standard method. And we're going to assume that in an example I give you. We're going to say we have a 50 amp grain drying system, and we're going to say that because of that, we have to use the standard method for our dwelling. Okay. All right. So looking at it right here, what you see is it says in 220.103, it says individual loads calculated in accordance with table 220.102. Okay. So you had to come up with your loads that we just finished working through in 220.102. You had to come up with those loads, right? And so once you come up with those loads, we're going to show you how to apply them. And I'm going to show you how this works with the loads, kind of the loads that we just utilized, so you get a better understanding. And we threw in an extra grain thing in there, and we'll throw in some other, what we call assorted loads, which under this count might be just some little random loads that were added together, okay, just to kind of give us something to be able to work up. All right, so here's what we've got. We've got a service. It's a common service. It's going to supply a dwelling, and it's going to supply farm equipment. And we want to know what the minimum service is for this load using this. So now, since we have a common service, we're going to have to to take the values and start working through it here. All right, so you want to work through it, and you've already, be honest with you, you've already assessed your loads that you have in the farm, okay? You've already assessed them all by going through 220.102b, so it should be old hat for you. The only thing we're going to do is add some additional loads, okay, just to kind of round this thing out. So what we've got is same scenario, 120, 240 volt single phase system, supplying the dwelling and the farm loads. We have already done a dwelling calculation using the standard method, part 3, because we have electric heat in the dwelling and we have electric grain drying system in our farm. Okay, I want to go with the worst complicated scenario. You with me? All right, so we had to use the standard method for that. Now, it says all the loads that are expected to operate simultaneously, as I said before, was already determined to be 65 amps. The largest motor was that 10 horsepower motor. We determined that. It was a 240 volt motor, and it was single phase. We already established that. We have another load, which is 50 amps, which is ironically going to be our third largest individual load, but that's the electric grain drying system. And the remaining assorted loads that we might have in this farm would be 92 amps. And as you saw when I read it earlier at the beginning of 220.103, it could be other loads that were added together to come up with the 92 amps. Okay. Again, not brain surgery, but you're using the processes that you just use in 220.102b to determine what your loads are for this farm. And you're just bringing them all together here. So it is a little bit of redundancy, but there's different percentage values demand factor wise because you're worrying about a combination of loads here. Dwelling loads are going to be added at the end to whatever we're doing right here. All right, so let's kind of look at it now. Folks, first thing we want to do is what was the largest load? That was the simultaneous load, if you remember. That was the largest load. So if you look at this table, it says what is the largest load? Well, the largest load, you take it 100%, and that obviously was that 65 amps. That was the largest before when we did the 220.102b, and it's still the largest right now, okay? So that's what we have. So the 65 amps at full value, you write down 65 amps because it's taking that at 100%, so you write that down, okay? Now, the next largest load, if you remember, the next largest load we were dealing with in our dwelling was, in our farm load was that motor, right? That was the next largest load. And we had already done that. And that was 50 amperes at 125%, which is 62.5 amps. Now, since that was the second largest load, it says you take that value at 75%. So we're taking the 62.5, which was the 50 times 125% because of the rules in 430. Then we take that and we multiply that by 75%. Okay. And that is when we take it and you get your calculator out. If you have a calculator with you. If not, I'll do it with you. So 62.5 times 0.75 is 46.875. So we're going to say 47 amperes. Okay. So we're going to round that 47 amperes because 220.5b says that I have the option. I am permitted to round it. You can work with the full numbers if you want, but I have the right to round it. Okay. And if it's below 0.5, I have a right to drop it. Okay, in my calculation. So in this case, we're 46.8, so we're going to round to 47. So that's our motor load. So you write that down. That's your second one. That's the one at 75%. So you write that down. So far we have a 65 and we have a 47. So the next largest motor load the next largest loads that we have that I gave you was that 50 amp grain drying system. Okay, so that's the third largest load and individual load. Now, we have those other loads, those remaining loads of 92 amps, but that's just a accumulation of other assorted loads. The actual third largest load itself was that 50 amperes. So that's what we're using as the third largest load. And that was given to me in the explanation I just gave you a little while ago. So that would be 50 amperes times 65%. And that is 32.5. Of course, it's a 0.5. We could round it to 33, and that would be fine. So you have 33. Now, if you wanted to work with 32.5, you're perfectly fine. Most people will round it at the end anyway, so you can round it in the process or round it at the end or whatever. It's up to you. So what is the remaining loads? The remaining loads are all those assorted loads that we talked about in the explanation, which was 92 amps. So you take those remaining loads at 50%. So that would be 92. And again, those remaining loads could be anything from small branch circuits to something else on the farm, a little smaller motor or whatever it may be. You calculate it out. But we're applying demand factors here. So we can apply that, whatever that cumulative, and you saw it said that if motors of similar, we can add together. This was 92 amps of remaining load. And we do it at 50%, that's 46 amps. So what we're doing is now we're going to add all of these demands that we extracted from the largest motor, second largest, third largest, the largest load, the second largest load, and the third largest load, and then the percentage that we got from all of the remaining loads for this other than dwelling, and we're going to take it and add them together. So in our case, it was 65 plus 47 plus 33 plus 46 is 191 amperes. So the 191 amperes represents our other than dwelling loads. Now, as it says here, we're going to now bring in our dwelling unit loads. And we already did that under the standard method, and we determined, let's say it was 125 amperes of standard method load. So I'm going to add that 191 plus the 125 because we're bringing them together. Remember, combined service. That is 316 amperes. Now, the minimum rating, there is not a standard rating in 240.6A for 316, so the next largest size is 350. So the minimum size service for this farm load and dwelling unit load is 350 amperes. Now, the actual load is 316 amperes. That's our actual calculated load because it's all of this is a basis of a calculation. We started out with a connected load, and we worked our way down to a calculated load after applying demand factors. And that's how we determined it was a 350 amp rated service. And we will size our conductors to handle the calculated load and follow all of those rules that we need to do for conductor sizing, which we're not going to get into today's episode because I just wanted to talk about how you use the different tables in part 5 for farm load calculations. And my hope is that you got something out of that it wasn't too overly confusing. Again, you just have to read it. And I think once you do, you will get a better understanding of farm load calculations. So at any point any of this is confusing to you or any of it needs a little more clarity, I've done my best in a podcast. Again, my haters will be what they are. And if they think they can do a better job, I look forward to hearing their version of this, because if you listen out there, you're not going to find anybody out there trying to teach you how to do farm load calculations. Of course, they will say, well, we don't think it's necessary because there's not that many farms. Dude, they're all over the country. Teach people. Stop bashing people. Till next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.